Despite questions about electability, Senator Bernie Sanders is one of the most vocal bases in the 2020 Democratic primaries. Democratic socialist messaging hasn't changed since its rise to prominence in 2016, and he's so beloved that his support did not drop following his recent heart attack.
He actually appears to be picking up steam. According to polling by CNN and the University of New Hampshire, Sanders has surged to the top spot in the Granite State, polling at 21%. Senator Elizabeth Warren trails Vermont Senator by 3 points, followed then by Vice President Joe Biden. Joining us now to discuss how the senator will maintain this momentum is Dave Sirota, senior advisor and speechwriter for the Sanders campaign. Great to see you, Dave.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so how about that a strong fourth for Pete Buttigieg?
Yes.
What's your reaction? I mean, what are you guys seeing on the ground in New Hampshire? Does this square with what you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a great poll, and it represents what's really going on in New Hampshire. I mean, after the heart attack, there was a lot of talk that Bernie Sanders was done, it's over, the campaign's finished. I think we've seen, I think it was Time magazine that wrote that we've had some of the best, if not the best, 3 weeks of the entire campaign. And I think that's felt in Iowa, it's felt in New Hampshire. I think people, what you've seen is that you've seen Bernie Sanders talking a lot about corruption and corporate greed. Corruption and corporate greed is a central focus of this campaign. It's a central focus of what's on voters' minds. And I think that that message is going to be, I believe, and we believe, the central part and the central debate in the Democratic primary. Who can really take on corruption and corporate greed? You've had Joe Biden out there saying nothing will fundamentally change. That's been sort of his brand. Right. Bernie Sanders' brand has been, and his message has been, we are going to take on corruption and corporate greed, and you can trust me by looking at my record to know that I am serious about taking on those issues.
So Dave, I mean, we also have one of the most fascinating parts Crystal and I looked at was actually the rise in who they identify as more progressive. So Bernie Sanders is now leading, what is it, 29%? 29 points over Elizabeth Warren. What is it, the contrast you think the campaign has made in order to make that case to these voters who seem to be catching on to what you're putting forward?
Bernie Sanders is talking a lot about building a multiracial working class movement. And I want to underscore working class. Yeah. I saw a tweet out there. The basic gist of it was that Bernie is the candidate who uses that phrase, working class. Right. And I think that is not just a slogan for him, it's not just a brand, it's when you see those crowds at events, when you see the polls that break apart who's supporting which candidate on the basis of on the demographics, income levels. You see it really is a working class movement. Now, part of the challenge is that you're building a working class movement inside a party that also has upper income demographics, upper income congressional districts and the like. So Bernie Sanders is building a working class movement within that party, and I think that is a key distinction. And so when you put that coalition behind a message of fighting corruption and corporate greed, that is I think makes him a unique candidate in this race, a unique brand, a unique message in this race, one that differentiates him.
Well, and to that point, you all have a new digital ad up in Iowa featuring Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez talking about why she supports Senator Sanders. Let's take a listen to that.
We should have a society that guarantees 21st century economic human rights. What makes Senator Sanders very different is that his aspiration is our aspiration. That's the kind of leadership that I think we need right now.
What I really like about this ad is at the beginning she talks about how she was a waitress when she first even knew who Bernie Sanders was. And she didn't have a living wage, and she didn't have health care, and she didn't think she deserved those things. And Senator Sanders made her believe that she was worthy of those basic human rights. I think that's incredibly powerful, and I think it's particularly powerful to see a woman of color, a working class woman of color, making the case in the overwhelmingly white state of Iowa, and clearly the campaign thinks that that's going to land. Talk about that.
It's an empowerment message. The campaign, the message of Bernie's campaign is that essentially the working class of this country has been ripped off and fleeced and doesn't have to actually accept that. That it challenges the assumption that, as Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez said, we don't have to accept the status quo, that people, and Bernie talks about this all the time, about having economic rights are political rights. It's all the same message, which basically is saying that the existing status quo of declining wages, of having trouble affording health care, of being burdened with college debt, that doesn't have to actually be the status quo in America. It shouldn't be the status quo in America, and it can change.
So, Dave, there's a new interview that Senator Sanders gave to John Harwood. He talked a little bit about how he would handle people like West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin. I know this has been highlighted by the campaign as really a central way in which he would approach governance. Tell us a little bit about that.
So in that interview, he was asked, how are you going to get a senator like Joe Manchin to support something like Medicare for all? And what Bernie Sanders said is, in these challenges, when we are facing congressional opposition, whether it's from Democrats like Joe Manchin or Republicans, my administration and me as president will go into states where there is that opposition to help organize pressure on those lawmakers to support a working class progressive agenda. Now, we haven't really seen that very much from presidents going back a long time. We certainly haven't seen lots of presidents go in willing to whip up and organize support against people who are blocking their agenda from their own party. Sure. And this is a theory of change issue. This is what I think also sets apart Bernie Sanders, is that he is saying the work doesn't end when the election happens. That's when the work, that's the beginning, that's the end of the beginning, getting elected, and then the work to pass the agenda happens with a president, an organizer-in-chief who's willing to go into those states to organize that pressure.
Which is different than for specifically what Obama did, who had this great movement, and then it was basically all disbanded and like, we got it from here. We talked to Michael Moore last week about his endorsement of Senator Sanders, which is not terribly surprising. He's been a Bernie supporter for a long time, but still a big deal for him to come out and speak on his behalf as he did. And he said he really felt like there was a little bit of a different Bernie post-heart attack, that he was a little more, and this is my phrasing, not his, but a little more contemplative, a little bit more, I would say, vulnerable. Is that something you've seen? I mean, you've worked with the senator for a long time as well. Have you seen a change?
I mean, look, at one level, he's been pushing the same agenda and the same message and with the same values for 40 years. At another level, I think that the heart attack, I think, it personalized in some ways the agenda that he's fighting for. I mean, yeah. He is the candidate who's been championing Medicare for all, and he goes through a health issue. And I think that then being able to speak to Medicare for all, having gone through a health issue, having gone through a challenge like that, it doesn't just humanizes it, it personalizes it. And I think that coming out of that, we're now heading into the stretch run of the campaign. It's invigorated the campaign in the sense of these issues are that much more important, and I can speak to them that much more personally.
Yeah, so I saw also in a recent interview that Senator Sanders gave that he said doesn't think he's currently in a place where he needs to release a plan on Medicare for all, specifically on pay-fors and some of the other implementation mechanisms. I mean, and at a time when, a lot of Sanders surrogates are hitting Elizabeth Warren for not doing the same thing, why is the Sanders campaign not releasing that plan right now?
Well, first of all, Senator Sanders has introduced a menu of potential funding options, and those are detailed and they are clear. The other point here is that, look, whatever the funding plan ends up being in negotiations with Congress, we have to step back and remember that there is so much waste in the healthcare system, that other countries, other industrialized countries, are able to provide and guarantee healthcare to all of their citizens for, in many cases, half the expenditure that we in this country are spending on healthcare. So the bottom line is, again, there is a menu of funding options that Senator Sanders has put forward, but whatever the ultimate funding plan is, The idea that we can't do this, that is an outrageous idea. That is the radical idea that's being put forward by opponents of Medicare for All, that we can't do what other countries have been able to do for decades.
Last question for you. If there's a lengthy impeachment trial in the Senate, how will the campaign adjust? And do you worry about that distracting from these issues of Medicare for All, Green New Deal, and other things that you all are championing?
Well, look, first of all, I think the impeachment inquiry will focus centrally on corruption. Corruption as a concept, whether there was impeachable corruption in the White House, and I think that is something that, first of all, it's a constitutional duty of a U.S. senator, but it's also, I mean, it underscores what many of the candidates have been talking about. Logistically, being in Washington or being out on the campaign trail, that's going to be a challenge. I don't think there's been an example of a presidential race unfolding in the middle of an impeachment inquiry, but look, Senator Sanders has said that he wants the inquiry to go forward, and he's serious about reviewing the charges if and when they come.
Yeah. Well, Dave, thank you so much for joining.
Great to see you.
Really
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Next up on Rising, we often discuss the differences between Senator Elizabeth Warren and Senator Sanders on Medicare for All. The biggest contrast seems to be how each of the presidential candidates might pay for a single-payer system, as we were just discussing.
Next, we're going to talk to David Pakman. He's host of the David Pakman Show. He gives a take on candidates' approach on Medicare for All. We're going to dive into some other stories that's in the news when Rising continues.